And we are live. So
All
if
right.
you are just joining us, I'm Lauren Van Hemert from RDU on Stage, and this is Alisa Hurwitz. Am I
Lisa
pronouncing
Hurwitz. Yep.
Hurwitz? Also known as Dr. Drama on social media. And we're going to talk all about mental health and pandemic fatigue. You started your mental health live series right around the time I started my live chat series. And you've spoken to lots and lots of Broadway stars and creatives. And so I want to get into all of it. If you have any questions while we're chatting, always put them in the comments on Facebook and I will get to them. But so people know you are a practicing clinical psychologist
Yes.
and you found a way to explore the intersection between theater and psychology, which I think all of us kind of innately know there's some sort of connection, but
Yeah.
you put it to words.
Yeah, I've tried.
So when did you have the aha moment that there was a tie between psychology and theater and that you were the person to be Broadway's psychologist?
I think I mean, I certainly had that. It was somewhere. As long as I've had those co-interests, I think the same thing that attracted me to theater, as a consumer, attracted me to psychology. Just the fascination with human behavior, human emotion, what makes us tick, how we relate to each other, and becoming a psychologist was such a clear and sure path, and that was my calling, and because I could always be an audience member, and that in my theater life was my calling, so to speak. And it wasn't until about I would say 3 years ago now, where in my professional life I was just getting to a point where things were really comfortable. And so that kind of all those learning curves of being earlier in your career weren't there. And I was looking for a challenge in something fresh and new, and I guess just kind of something that would give me back some energy, with some enthusiasm. Enthusiasm isn't the right word, but just the challenge of like I said, of early career psychology. I passed through that point in my career, and it came to me like an epiphany. I guess this is what artists feel sometimes, where it just like a muse. It spoke to me in a dream. I just woke up the next morning and I said, oh, this is where your passion is, and this is what where your other passion is, and you need to do something with psychology and theater. Oh, I think you're muted. Can you hear me still? Maybe hit the space bar back.
My family was making noise, and so I muted myself.
I relate.
I totally agree. And I love it when artists and creative people find ways to blend their passions in this really interesting, cool way. Was there a specific show you remember seeing going, yeah, I can totally analyze this?
Yes, there were two. There were two. I mean, like most young kids of my generation, I think probably, I'm guessing can probably relate to this too. Like Annie was like on I wore that record out.
Me too.
But yeah, yes, but I don't think I was interested in it psychologically. I think I just loved the storytelling through song and dance, like just kind of pure in kind of that way. I was like, oh, okay, like she's an orphan. I don't think I was intrigued in that way. But rewinding the tape, so I grew up on summer stock theater and cast albums, and just all the classics, the ones that we call classics, on vinyl. Pajama Game and How to Succeed in Business and West Side Story and Camelot and
The golden age.
yes,
What I would
so to
call the
speak,
golden age.
yes, yeah, and you know, and so I grew up on those, and like I said, going to summer stock theater, and I remember being 7 years old, and this is not where you think it's going. Being taken to see a chorus line. All the adult stuff went over my head, completely over my head, and all the rest of it. Like, I just remember being fascinated. So I'm 7 years old, just so it's simple, but being fascinated by the idea that the actors and the characters were two different people, and that that just the idea of acting, that these people were pretending to be these other people on the stage in such a convincing way, in a convincing manner. And it was, for 7-year-old me, that was amazing. I just thought that was so amazing. And then fast forward to now, you know, I'm still consuming theater all along this time. 16 years old, my parents take me to my first Broadway production. The tour of Phantom of the Opera in Boston at the gigantic Wang Center, if anybody's a Boston theater person. I mean, just way too big of a house to be seeing a show in. And we were way back, so far back that when the Phantom takes his mask off and, you know, everybody gasped, I was like, he looks fine.
What just happened?
But you could have knocked me over with a feather. Not only was I bowled over by the kind of the power of the production, but my parents, God bless them for having patience with me, because I analyzed the themes of darkness and light for weeks and months. It was not weeks afterwards. And that's for me where that intersection was born, and lightness and dark and death and life. And I analyzed that thing to the bone. And yeah, that's where it really, really sparked.
So interesting. So one aspect of your resume that I find really fascinating is that you served as a consultant for various theaters on their productions of shows like Next to Normal and Indoor Person, which I think premiered off Broadway in February, right? Right before the shutdown?
Yeah, that's right.
Crazy.
That's correct. Yeah. It was
There,
technically the last show I saw, in the live theater, was Indoor Person.
did you see Six? Did you take your daughter to see Six?
I did. Not on Broadway though. That was in our home regional theater, the American Repertory Theater. I got to see it with them. Oh, indeed. Love that show.
And that's on my bucket list of shows to see when everything reopens.
Yeah.
But there are so many shows that explore mental health issues, like Next to Normal, Dear Evan Hansen. And Dear Evan Hansen is very polarizing, at least here, for folks who have experienced anxiety and mental health issues. There's been a lot of discussion around it when it came here on tour. So which shows tackle the issues responsibly and correctly in their storylines, and which shows don't?
I mean, there are definitely examples of shows from the 60s that were really harried in the way that they dealt with mental health. I'm thinking of, a show like, oh gosh, I'm totally blanking. Kristen Chenoweth was in the revival.
Promises.
Thank you. I get mommy brain. You understand? Promises. The way the script is written, and kind of the conceptualization of like why she tries to commit suicide. It's very, for lack of a better term, like unsophisticated. But I think at the time there was an unsophisticated understanding about mental illness, and I think it was just like the awareness that exists was kind of where they were at. That was it. But I think a show like, I think there's shows that are very obviously about mental illness and how we deal with it, like Next to Normal, which I think is very sophisticated and deft at dealing with not only at multiple layers, right? Not only her bipolar disorder, but also codependency, also trauma. And it's very, very sophisticated in how it deals with it. I think there are merits to Dear Evan Hansen, and I think that the merits outweigh the caveats. But I think the discussion is healthy.
Absolutely, it is.
Yeah.
And I think for young people to see that character on stage and kind of go, yeah, that's totally me.
Yeah.
It's good kind of representation, even if it's not as accurate maybe as people might like it to be, or consequential as people may want it to be. That's what I was hearing about it when it was on tour, that he did all these things, there were no consequences. But the young people around me that I know who saw it could look beyond that and just see a relatable character.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I mean, I think that there could have been a symbolic consequence for him, but I think he suffered. I think that was his consequence, is the inner turmoil that his dishonesty and attempts to present himself in a way that he thought would make him more likable. That was the cost for him.
Absolutely.
As it often is.
Absolutely. It's also interesting to me, I saw a show back in January called Bourbon at the Border, and interestingly enough, it explored mental health issues and racism, and how the people who really protested during the civil rights movement in the 60s, how those civil rights protests affected them mentally long term. Really fascinating, emotional show. And in this particular case, the woman who directed it, she has experience and a background in social work. And so she was able to really nurture the actors, and as they navigated these big issues. I know there are so many theaters comfortable with working with stage combat people. They're comfortable with they're getting comfortable with bringing in an intimacy coordinator and an intimacy director. Should theaters also think about bringing in a psychologist or mental health professional for some of these shows, like a Next to Normal or a Spring Awakening, that's dealing with these big issues?
I mean, that would certainly be my wish. I mean, I know that, I know that it's that commercial theater is a business, but in talking with actors, I've heard a lot of them, make the point that, a Broadway show, a Broadway contract, they will take care of your physical health, but they offer nothing for your mental health. And so what about an actor who's in a show like Miss Saigon and is being re-traumatized every night? Maybe that's not her particular trauma or his particular trauma. But there's certainly a lot of overlap. Or a show like, and I'm not calling any show out, because I don't necessarily know what they have or haven't offered, but a show like Jagged Little Pill, I do have a lot of affection for that show. There's sexual trauma in the show. There's racial trauma in the show. There's misogyny in the show, so what about chances are, by statistically, some of the people in that show have experienced sexual abuse themselves. And there's a scene in the show where oh my God, he scared me. My daughter just startled me. Good night. I have to kiss the dog.
Oh, so sweet.
Did not hear you coming. That was really bad timing too. You almost heard something I didn't want you to hear. Where they're talking about the song is about sexual assault, and they're talking about why isn't no enough, and they're kind of reenacting hands being all over them without their consent. And chances are several of those actors themselves are survivors. And,
And they're so young. They're so young. A lot
yeah,
of them
yeah, yeah.
making their Broadway debuts in that show.
Hmm.
It's
I know they used an intimacy director, and they use it, and that was fantastic. And I'm sure that covered some of the ground. But what if somebody was being triggered by that, in spite of all the safety?
Well, it is very interesting that you brought up Jagged Little Pill, because that was the last Broadway show I saw, and I really liked it, but it was triggering for me in a way that I did not expect. When I was a young person, had been assaulted, and when my problem with Jagged Little Pill is there's so many issues in it that it's hard to kind of keep an eye on what issue is actually the storyline. But by the time I actually figured out that this was MJ's story, I literally almost fell out of my chair, because that was my story. And I thought, wow, no one's telling this story. And this is really interesting for me. And I do hope Elizabeth Stanley gets a Tony Award, because she was,
her performance. I think she's the unspoken hero of that in that cast.
yes.
I mean, because Lauren Patton is giving a meteoric performance. To me, what Elizabeth Stanley is doing is a slow burn, and it's a hell of a slow burn.
It is. It's about 3/4 into the show by the time you get it, and you kind of go, oh my goodness. So
which is so, and it's so accurate, right? Is it okay to give spoilers on here, or no?
I hope, okay, if you're interested in seeing Jagged Little Pill, cover your ears.
Yeah, because I think this is a really valuable point. It's worth a spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
They get that really right, because there are certain things that are risk factors for addiction, and trauma history is one of them. It's a big one. And any mood, emotional dysregulation disorder, like a bipolar mood disorder or an ADHD, are also risk factors. But that they got that spot on, and it's such an important story to tell.
And it's not what I'm kind of over the whole jukebox musical thing, but this was a very refreshing new take.
I saw it first at the American Repertory Theater in previews. So there was buzz about Lauren Patton's performance. But no reviews out yet. I love the creative team, and that was kind of enough reason for me to want to go see it. And I love it. I love that when you see something new with fresh ears and fresh eyes, and those orchestrations, first of all, just absolutely knocked me off my feet. But just to be on that roller coaster of like, I have no preconceptions about what story they're going to tell me. And then to be so surprised by how they wove those songs into the narrative in a way that made it really feel like if you were not in the United States in the 90s and had not heard that, you're rock, right? And you've not heard those songs before, you would think those songs were written for those characters.
Absolutely. And Lauren Patton, not to discount Lauren Patton's performance or Celia Gooding's performance or any of their performances, it's such a stellar ensemble, but I really just felt like Elizabeth Stanley, the way she carried that show so in such a nuanced way and really let it build. She let you really discover the character. It wasn't, oh, in the first 5 minutes, I totally get what's happening here. It's like you said, it's a slow build, and it's a pretty brilliant performance.
Yeah.
So much so, it was very triggering for me. I had to go back to my hotel room afterwards and go, okay, it was the show. I'm sure she's fine.
I do wish that even bigger, I think, than having psychologists or social workers as consultants on shows, because I do think, like I said, intimacy directors, and having seen intimacy directors work, behind the scenes, I think they cover a lot of that ground that a psychologist could. I wish that they would put trigger warnings on shows with content that is likely to be triggering to a lot of people. Sexual assault is horribly overly common. Shows need to put a trigger warning. I know they want you to kind of go in and experience the story, but it's not worth actually not triggering people in the vernacular way of like, oh, I'm so triggered, actually triggering post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in people. I think that needs to be, just like they put warnings about gunshots, they need to put warnings about sexual assault.
Yes, I totally agree. I think in the case of Jagged Little Pill, I've been very open on this program. So I think people who followed it know I suffered from anxiety and PTSD for 2 years. And when I went to New York, I guess it was last November now, and saw Jagged Little Pill, I was really I had gone through the therapy. I actually went through cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm a big believer in it. I I really felt like I was more myself, and that show set me back a little bit as far as anxiety. And I remember about a month and a half after the show, I had a panic attack. And my husband just looked at me and was like, "What is happening?" I was like, "I am responding to Jagged Little Pill, which I saw a month and a half ago, but that is what I'm responding to." And I do agree with you. I think shows need to have trigger warnings, so you kind of know what you're going into. Because I was like you, I saw the very first preview in New York.
Did you? Were you there? I was there that night.
You were?
Yeah.
I was. It was my last night in New York. I was there for a conference. I ended up buying a ticket at the last minute. I sat really high up in the balcony, and I was like, "Oh, I want to see it because who knows when I'm going to be back in New York."
And the place was electric that night.
It was,
which was a thrilling theatrical experience.
It was hard not to get swept up in it. It really was energizing, and
those first notes began and the place just was kind of vibrating.
It was. So I do agree with you. And it's funny, I have a friend who is an intimacy director, and we were actually talking today, and she said, while mental health training, she called it like mental health first aid, is definitely part of the training she's received. She's not a mental health professional. And so she was like, I can kind of direct people and do the CPR needed to get somebody through a moment. But the long-term work, there really does, it would be beneficial to have a professional.
I mean, I would love to see shows provide therapists, in the same way they provide, mental health therapists in the same way they provide physical therapists.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And for the actors, like you said, there have been all sorts of audience surveys done recently, but one that was conducted in DC over the summer was done in April, and then they followed up with a second survey in the summer, showed that only like 16% would go back to the theater within a month if theater was open. It was like somewhere between 16 and 25%. And I did put a link, if you're following along on Facebook, on the Facebook post, so you can see the actual survey. I've been to 2 shows in the last month because we're inching closer to reopening some of our live venues here in North Carolina. One of those shows, I felt very safe and comfortable. One I did not. So what do you think audiences are going to need to do, or what do you think theaters are going to need to do for audiences to feel safe? Or what will it take for audiences, I guess, from a psychological standpoint, to feel safe again?
I think, and of course I can't speak to the medical part of it. But I think psychologically, in order to feel safe, I think people need to know that theaters, of course, are following the guidelines, that that whatever the kind of best practices recommendations are at the time to be safe in those situations, for the theaters to show good faith that they're trying to get people back in the theater, because it's important to have that community, not because they're rushing it. And I also think that, maybe it sounds like a small thing, but I think people need to know that there are going to be people working in the theater, whether it's ushers or other people, who are going to protect them if some, like, say the rules are that you have to keep your mask in if it's an indoor theater, that people are going to enforce that. Because I think people will feel very on edge if they see people not following those rules and it's a safety issue. I think they need to feel like the theater is going to take care of that, that they have people working there equipped to enforce the safety rules.
And I think theaters need to be mindful that people's comfort levels really vary at this moment. So even somebody who loves the theater, is an avid theater goer, their comfort level may be, not in the best place right now. So I do feel that theaters need to be mindful of that. And I will say, the one experience I had recently where I did feel very comfortable and safe, I felt like the theater was really taking that into account, that patrons who expressed concerns about where they were sitting or how close they were to another patron, they moved them. They just literally picked up a chair. It was an outdoor venue, and moved them. And I thought,
Great.
all right, they're paying attention. They're mindful of what's happening. So I do think that's a big part of it. I know you are practicing anti-racism work, as I am, because I've seen on your blog posts, I know you are teaching your children, as I am.
Starts at home.
And you gotta, I mean, they're uncomfortable conversations to have, but the other really interesting thing I found about this particular study is it surveyed audiences about systemic racism in the theater. And a majority of audiences strongly felt that theaters need to take specific steps to fight racism through actionable change in their industry and beyond, including what shows are being done on stage and representation on stage. Something I've been really fascinated about is this idea, not just of social justice theater, but the idea of theater as bringing a community together or healing a community. We have a professional theater on the campus of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It's a Lort Theater. And last year, students tore Silent Sam, a statue of Silent Sam, down. And there was a lot of racial unrest and community unrest. I called it a community in crisis. And I interviewed the artistic director and I said, does the theater have a role in healing this community or bringing it together? Because here you are, the professional theater on campus. Do you feel that theaters have a role in addressing these kind of social issues and helping bring a community together or heal a community?
Yeah. Yes, big yes. First of all, on a systemic level, because every American institution has been laid on a foundation of racism. And so the theater has an obligation, like all of our institutions, to dismantle that racism. And then, that's the undoing to rebuild. And then I think that the other kind of side of that is that we have an opportunity also to experience healing. Theater, like I say a lot, theater can be therapeutic. We are in community together. We walk into a theater, we have now created like a micro community where we are sitting together, crew, cast, audience, to have a shared experience, which is so rare in our, very kind of digital disconnected world. Not to kind of overstate something that's been said, but it's a analog experience in a digital world. The healing that can happen, whether it's 50 people, whether it's 5,000 people, pandemic aside, that's a shared experience that can be healing. And that can either be, by producing shows that directly speak to to the harm that we have done for 400 years as a country, or indirectly by just having a shared joyful experience. But we need to speak to it directly too. We can't not. We can't not. We've been doing that. It's a race. All this history is a race. We can't keep doing that.
Yes, yes. And I'm happy that this period of time has allowed artists and creatives the freedom to speak out in a way that I'm not sure they would have spoken out had everything been working. I think we've had other events of police brutality that people protest, people react, but it hasn't been to the communal active level that I think it is now. And that's inspiring to me. So I hope it lasts. I hope it lasts.
Yeah. Well, we have to keep talking. We can help make it last by continuing to talk, and having those conversations. But I'll say, kind of having professional expertise in having difficult conversations with people. It's only difficult because we're not used to it, right? We're not used to it. Our kids, it's not uncomfortable for them because they don't know any different. So now this becomes comfortable when we have those what feel uncomfortable conversations for us, and then how that then gets passed down to the next generation. That now these conversations that need to be had are comfortable and more likely to happen.
And I love kind of as a segue into comfortable conversations. You launched a mental health series on Instagram. Right in April, to talk to Broadway stars and creatives about mental health issues as they were navigating this crazy time. As you've hosted this series, are there any through lines or commonalities as far as mental health issues that you're hearing in these conversations?
So many, and to kind of take it as the wide continuum of mental health, as so the both sides of that equation, hearing themes of that so many actors are actually introverts, which I think is very interesting. So they get refueled by spending time alone, which I think is probably contrary to what we would assume. A lot of people with anxiety, a lot of people with anxiety. Another interesting thing that seemed to be particular to this time for actors is identity. So now that, for stage actors, things are starting to kind of step back in, right? But it's really, Broadway is really obviously not, and off Broadway. And so, kind of, going back to a chorus line, really that question of who am I? Am I my resume? Am I it, because it's such a hustle career to be, an actor on Broadway and off Broadway, and, all that entails. So much of their identity is wrapped up in the work and getting the next job. And doing them, even if you're in a contract for a year in a Broadway show, you're living the life of an Olympic athlete because your whole day revolves around doing the show. So right, especially if you're leading a show, you have to live like a monk on top of like an Olympic athlete. And so now, without that, who am I? And in a really healthy way, I'm hearing people kind of finding themselves pivoting and redefining themselves by who they are as, things that already exist, who they are to, how they treat other people, who they are as an aunt, who they are as a partner, who they are as a teacher, and that actor, kind of, yes, it's still they're passionate about it, but it's not the front runner in their identity anymore in this really beautiful, healthy way that this intermission has afforded.
I love that. And one thing I was hearing about as I was interviewing artists at the beginning of the pandemic was some of the artists I spoke to compared this to a grieving process. And do you find that? Do you compare this pandemic and what some people are going through to grief?
I think that the shutdown of Broadway specifically was a grief process. You know, and they kind of people kind of went through the stages of grief. You know, the those you know, kind of quintessential stages of grief. There was like denial at first. You know, I talked to some of the queens from Six, and and it was interesting to hear their experience of the day that Broadway shut down, because they were between shows and were supposed to open that night. They were getting ready for their opening night.
In an
You know,
hour. It was like
yeah,
6:50
yeah,
and everything shut down at 5 or something crazy.
yeah. Um, and they were fine. They were fine at first. Like all of the ones, all the queens I talked to, they were all like, no, I was okay. I just, you know, I kind of took care of everybody else, the family that was in town, or, you know, kind of just, okay, got to get my stuff out of the dressing room. We're probably going to be away for a week. You know, so there's a denial, and then, and on and on. And then the sadness hit them 3 weeks later, you know, a month later. But the pandemic itself, uh, I don't think we're in a grief process, because we're just surviving. And I
Mm.
think it's easy for us to forget, because we are, you know, in some ways our lives can look really similar. You know, whether or not it was a pandemic, if we had this set up, I'd still be sitting here, you know, having this conversation with you at 8:30. I'd be sitting right here doing this.
Yes.
So you know, it can kind of feel like things as normal, but it's not. And so when we're just surviving, and this is kind of true of any chronic stress, when we're just surviving, you can't process what you're going through. That grief is going to happen after we start going back to a new normal.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Not that
I
we're not feeling things now, right? It's a roller coaster, but the grief will happen later.
Well, and I think this whole year has thrown not just a pandemic, but some natural disasters,
Oh
and
God.
we're in the mid, you know, going into an election, and I think people are just, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And I do think, I know there's a lot of talk about pandemic fatigue. I really think it's a thing. I think people are feeling it. They're
Yeah.
just, there seems to be two schools of thought with people I speak to, either people who are over it and they want to get back to their lives and they don't care, or people who are still really frightened and they're still sheltered in place. So it
Yep.
seems to be an extreme.
Yeah. And those are the ones we hear about, of course, too, right? There's all the room in between. There are people who are just, you know, absolutely like clawing the walls. You know, some of my patients are in that category. They can't stand it. I mean, in a visceral way. You know, the limitations. There are people, you know, I see now, granted, this is not, you know, indicative of the entire population, but in the population of people who are seeking mental health treatment, at least in, you know, New Hampshire. But this is going to be true universally of anxiety, is that, uh, that a lot of people with anxiety, especially the kind of anxiety which tends to catastrophize, are
Mm.
doing quite well, because the catastrophe finally happened. The other shoe drops, and they're like, oh, this is what the problem is. Okay. And they've already thought through, they've thought through every possibility. So they've already thought through this, and they're doing okay.
It's so interesting to me because when everything first shut down, my brother passed away 3 years ago, and I literally went through 2.5 years of dealing with crippling anxiety to the point that I wasn't able to function.
Mm-hmm.
And um, when this pandemic hit, I was finally feeling myself again, and thought, and it's been a lot of work, it's been a lot of treatment, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
professional help, but I kind of said to my husband, I'm good. I've been preparing for this for 2.5
Right. You're in that category.
right now. I don't have
Yeah.
to leave my house, and it seems normal now. It doesn't seem so crazy. So,
Yeah.
um, but I do think it's really interesting that um, people that I don't think have experienced a lot of or maybe acknowledged a lot of anxiety or stress are feeling it now for maybe for the first time, and people who've lived with it for a long time are like, okay, it's good. We're
Yep.
fine.
Yep. Yep.
um, as we navigate all of these issues as we go into this election, I know a lot of people were feeling very triggered last night by this
Yeah.
court situation. Are there coping mechanisms that you can share with people?
Yeah. Yeah.
Any meditation or coping
Yeah.
skills?
It's something that has been just a constant refrain in in my sessions with folks has been the question, how much news are you consuming? It can, this year, and now especially when everything's so concentrated because of the situation that we're in, it's so important to be very mindful about how much news you're consuming. Yeah, so that's the first thing is to what's your goal in listening to the news? Is it to be aware of what's going on, and if so, at what point have you heard enough, and you're not getting any new information, and shut it off. Do yourself a favor and shut it off. And then it's just other ways to cope. Exercise, as much as you are, in whatever ways you are physically able to move, and that varies from person to person. Exercise is as effective as medication for mild to moderate anxiety and depression. It's incredibly powerful. If you think about it, our bodies were really evolved around being incredibly physical. I mean, compared to our lives now, incredibly physical lives. It's only in the last 100 years or so, or maybe 120 years, from the Industrial Revolution on, where we technology allowed us to be more sedentary, but our bodies were created around being very physically active. So it makes sense. Yeah. What?
Moving.
Moving. Yes. So exercise and pets. Oh, getting outside, because vitamin D is linked to mood. So that's another one that can really help. And then if you have pets, cuddle with them. It releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, and that makes us feel good. It makes them feel good too. Incidentally, they also release oxytocin, but it's very good for your mental health to cuddle with your pet.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Um, I'm also a big believer in seeking professional help. I think there's a lot of stigma around mental health, and so I do. I'm an advocate for seeking
Yeah.
professional help. As somebody who's gone through it myself, it's not, some of these issues are as crippling as physical um, ailments. So I think it should be treated the same way, and sadly, it's not. But
Yeah. But even using your platform and talking openly about your experience, you're helping to destigmatize mental health and destigmatize going to therapy. And I 100%, agree. That talking to a therapist can be so beneficial. It's kind of got to be kind of a team approach. There's so many things that you can do to help yourself. And talking to professionals is a great part of that.
I love that you call it a team approach, because when my daughter was diagnosed with autism in 5th grade, she's 17 now, so we are well past this. But when she was first diagnosed, we had a lot of professionals who we were working with, and I used to tell my daughter, they're just part of your team.
Yeah.
We're all on the team together, and it was a easy way for her to wrap her brain around what was happening.
I love that.
I am seeing a lot of advertisements on social media, on television, everywhere about online mental health programs, telemedicine, teletherapy. What questions should people be asking as they seek online therapy or teletherapy.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because not all professionals are created equal. Not
Yeah.
all counselors are created equal.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a great question. There's a distinction first between, telemedicine
Mhm.
with somebody who is part of a brick and mortar practice, versus some of these mental health services that are offered, that are not brick and mortar, so they are only ever going to be available online. All the major ones that I've seen, they all require their therapists to be licensed in their state, and that's kind of the consumer protection. So I think you can know that they're, that those are all those major ones are probably have people who are trained and competent. With any therapist, the number one thing that you got to ask yourself is, from the first few sessions, do I feel as the patient, as a consumer, as a client, that this is a good fit? Because it is the number one predictive factor of treatment outcome. It's not years of practice. It's not treatment modality. It's not where you trained. It is goodness of fit. And so it has to feel like a good, like a good fit to you, because it's relational. That's what's healing about it. The rest of it, it matters. Cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective, but if it's not coming from somebody who you feel connected to, it won't matter.
Yes.
So shop around. And then the other thing I'll say about the therapy that is from these newer kind of services that are only available virtually, they're not, like right now I'm only providing teletherapy for social distancing reasons, for safety. I don't need to explain. You get the picture. But I have a brick and mortar practice, and all those people, when I'm back there, are going to come see me, in person. Now with this other style, I think there's benefits to it, for sure. Accessibility being one of them, on multiple levels. The risk with it not being in a time and place are a physical time and place is boundaries. And that's very important to treatment. It creates the kind of the sacred space for it to be safe. Right. And confidentiality is an absolute basic tenet of therapy. You have to know that, that you have to feel safe, that it's going to be confidential. You have to feel like it is a space where only you and your therapist are present. And you have to feel like the time and the place is for you, and it's set aside, and that's your space and your time, for nothing else. The risk with it being, and I don't think this is, inevitable, but the things you have to look for if you're accessing a virtual service is the boundaries. You want to make sure it's not feeling too collegial or friendly. Yes, you want your therapist to be friendly, but not your friend. Right? There's a boundary. It should not be a two-way street. I'm not talking to my patients about my problems, or my stressors.
Yes.
You should not be hearing about your therapist's problems. That's like a red flag, what's the saying? Like a red flag. Yeah. You should feel like that you have their attention. You should feel like, whatever time or opportunities are set aside for you guys to connect, that those are honored.
I love that. Well, this has been amazing. I'm so glad to connect with you.
Me
uh,
too.
and talk about my favorite thing, which is the theater.
Yeah.
It is my happy place. It is my sanctuary. I've said it many times that it is where I go to escape, but also go to work out problems. You see something on stage and you're able to process it because you're in this dark space with no technology. It's really interesting.
It's a therapeutic, it's a sacred place, like a therapy room is. Right.
Yes.
There are boundaries, there are rules. There are things that, that make it feel safe. That when Sweeney Todd, jumps on the table swinging his razor, he's not going to attack you. right? It's like being on a roller coaster where you know
Yes.
it's scary, but it's safe, right? So it in that way, there's some similarities, I think.
I do too. Very interesting. Well, Mental Health Live is twice a week, every week on Instagram, and I put links to your social media handles in the notes of this video, so people can access your Facebook page, your Instagram page, and hear all of these great conversations you're having, because I think it's important, like you said, to destigmatize it.
Yeah, and I've been blessed to have some wonderful guests on, being very part of the solution by being very open about their experiences with mental health, mental illness, and really helping take some of those bricks down. So there's some great conversations there, and they're archived there in the IGTV, so people can watch previous episodes.
And I have put also a link to your website, so people can read the blogs, because there's a lot of interesting articles about various shows, a lot of shows that people love, and mental health issues. So I'm just happy to make the connection, and
Same.
just stay safe and healthy. And hopefully when things open back up and there's a Broadway con or something with Broadway makers, I'll get to see you and meet you.
I know. Oh, my heart. Yes. My heart, my community. Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking me to be a guest, and for the wonderful conversation and really thoughtful questions.